shall we resume?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Thanks everybody for hanging in there. I see there's a number of people continuing to log in. The numbers are picking up. So our final session of our 15th meeting. And I've been looking forward to this session for a while. For those of you who've been actively participating in the working groups, we've been working for some months towards synthesis activities within working groups, but also across working groups, and looking forward to hearing about the progress of those activities at this point, as I'm sure many of you. So without further ado, we'll be starting off. We had a little bit of a change in the agenda, and we'll be starting off with Natalie Bowman, and we'll be giving us an update on the snowscapes synthesis activities. Over to you, Natalie.
We can't hear you, Natalie. Better?
There you go.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to give a quick summary of what we've been working on with the snowscape working group. So as a reminder, our focus really generally is on how spatial and temporal dynamics of snowscape properties influence ecosystem dynamics, and that includes soil active layer development, winter soil respiration, soil plant atmosphere carbon exchange. Wow, things really moved around on these slides. Vegetation community dynamics, disturbance regimes, wildlife habitat, and movement. We have a number of people in this working group, and I would say that on most of the calls we have about 8 to 10 people on average who are present and actively involved. And so if anyone else would like to join this working group, just email this email address, and we'd be very happy to have you. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have two main synthesis activities. The first one is an integrated study focused on how quantifying how snow has its fingers in everything. Next slide. And the second one is more of what I'm calling a cross-working group pollination effort, which I think will result in a number of different, I won't call them products, but activities that might end up in products. So I will get into what I mean by that a little later. But I'll start off by explaining the integrated study and where we are with developing that. Next slide. Okay, so we started off, next slide, with brainstorming some snow ecology questions. And we spent quite a bit of time discussing what we all felt were the most important questions in snow ecology in Arctic boreal regions. Probably 2 or 3 calls and some emails back and forth. And in the end, the long and short of it is we ended up deciding that we felt that the most interesting and timely and unexplored questions that we had related to how snow and wildfire interact with one another in both directions. And so the question really boiled down to how are snow properties both influenced by wildfire, and then in turn, how do they in turn influence ecosystem recovery and vulnerability to fire? So this little diagram here is showing all the different interactions and the role of snow in those. Next slide. So we spent a couple calls talking about this question, and as you might imagine happens when you start talking about a question with this many feedbacks and talking about ecology, as always happens, models that you're going to use are going to get more complicated. The number of types of observations you're going to use, or the model variables you're going to use are going to be more complicated, or more numerous. And so things really quickly got complicated. And so we're in a little bit of a game of hot potato right now, where we're trying to figure out how can we tackle this important problem, but not give our snow modelers, our ecosystem snow modelers, a ton of extra work for all the work on them, the analytical work on them, but still be able to get at this question. So this is sort of where we are with this. We know this is the question we want to get at, but I think we need to talk a little bit more and try to hone in on a piece of this, and try to figure out a way that we can actually make it doable instead of like a huge, new, full-blown, very complex study that may be a little too much for the working group. Okay, next slide. Okay, the other activity that we're focused on is this cross-working group pollination. So this is something that I've talked about in the past, where the snowscape working groups, people working on snow ecology, are interested in how snow interacts with different parts of the ecosystem. And so it makes sense to us to be talking to people in other working groups. So we want to be talking to the carbon, hydrology, veg dynamics, veg structure, fire, and multi-disturbance synthesis groups to not only find out how we can provide them with fit-for-purpose snow products through our snow modeling efforts that can help them advance their science. So what role does snow play in your science, and what can we give you to help include that in your scientific framework, but also what can we perhaps get from you that we need to not only improve our snow modeling, but also to address our own snow ecology interactive studies and questions that we have. So next slide, working group leads you, you should expect a call. Next slide, you should expect a call from us sometime soon to set up a call or two or three to start to talk about these reciprocal needs, or what we hope are reciprocal needs between us and yourself. Okay, next slide. So to give an example of what seems to be the most pressing need, and perhaps the most obvious one, is a link between the snowscape group and hydrology in permafrost. So we know from long-term studies, and this example here is taken from a paper by Monteau et al. We know from studies such as this that snow depth, for example, that's shown in this figure here, is really important to controlling the depth of the active layer, where deeper snow leads to deeper active layers. But it's not just snow depth, of course, it's also the other physical properties of the snowpack layer that are also important. And it's these sort of products that we can provide to help the permafrost group start to answer these sorts of questions and include them in their spatially explicit, temporally explicit, their own modeling and mapping efforts. Next slide. John Kimball showed us on Monday work from his own group from Yi et al. 2019, relationships between the timing of the zero curtain and how that's changed over time and how it relates to motor snow onset trends. And that is a really nice example of how we can provide something different, something, similar. We can certainly provide snow onset trends, but also different snow variables that you can't get so easily, or in some cases at all, from satellite sensors. And we can get these with just a small adjustment to current versions of snow model. And these could yield a spatially and temporally explicit thermal resistant products for the permafrost and active layer community. And of course, this plays back, and it should be important in terms to carbon dynamics and vegetation dynamics and distribution as well. Okay, next slide. So in terms of the types of things that we are looking to get from other working groups, so when the phone does ring, be prepared for us to perhaps be asking you for some things that you might be able to provide for us. In our discussions on that fire snow interaction study that we are working towards, we've realized that fire currents, fire severity, and the influence of black carbon are things that we need to be thinking about and including in our feedback study. Next slide. At the same time, whether we're considering fire or not, things that we could use to improve upon the snow model products are things we can get from the LiDAR that the veg structure and function group uses a whole lot. So crown areas that tell us about canopy intersection, so the snow that is caught on the canopy. Vegetation structure that can tell us a lot about where snow is accumulating when it's raining. And then snow on and off the snow depth, which you can also get from the LiDAR during the on and off, if we get on and off data. Okay, I think that's it. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. I was just about to give you a warning in terms of wrapping it up, and I don't have any questions for you at the moment, and I know you can't stick around to the end, but if questions come up, we will have those posted and you can respond to them online.
Great, yeah.
So thank you, and we will move along. Next up is Brendan Rogers and Laura Chavez, who will be splitting the fire and insect disturbance presentation. Not sure who goes first.
Hi, Scott. It's Brendan. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I'll lead it, and then Laura, I guess if you want to come in at the end and talk about the tundra synthesis, feel free. So, hi everyone. It's good to see many of you, at least virtually. I'm going to talk about some work that the previously fire disturbance working group has been undertaking for the last couple of years, now transitioning to the fire and insect disturbance working group. So a lot of this I'll present was initiated during phase 1 a few years back and is reaching relative maturity. Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide, please. Yes, there you go. So here we're during phase 1 for primary projects focused on wildfire, led by Borgo Chavez, Lavoda Mac, and myself. All of these projects, that's not counting the airborne projects. All of these contributed to the syntheses that I will discuss. I should mention that thus far they're all focused on boreal forests. But really everything was kicked off by a 2.5-day workshop in Flagstaff organized by Michelle Mack, Nancy Walker, Jill Johnstone, and Jen Balter, where we sort of collectively pooled our data and had some pretty intense brainstorming sessions. It was highly effective. And the two main foci from that workshop and coming out of it are more on combustion, so how much carbon is being emitted when a fire passes through, and then regeneration, so post-fire regeneration in terms of species success. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with the combustion, which has been kind of the majority of the work. And so we have a database now just recently archived on the ORNL DAC, Walker et al. And you can see on the map there our sites by the different groups, covering a lot of the sort of ecosystem gradients and fire frequency gradients that we're hoping to get. Not perfect, but it's pretty darn good. In total, we have over 1,000 burn sites, which is pretty rich for this type of data. A lot of, so above ground and below ground combustion, below ground being soil organic matter, a lot of associated characteristics. Should note that most of the sites in Canada here are through funded, above funded projects. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to walk through some of the high level science results that are sort of in some level of the publication pipeline. So this first paper by Zanti, it's now in revision in Frontiers in Forest and Global Change, and it's kind of looking at the sand level characteristics and burn dynamics from these sites categorized by different ecoregions. So here organized from Alaska boreal interior, sort of in the northwest going down to the southern part of the boreal and above domain with the boreal plains and softwood shield. So you can just hit the next slide, please. There's a yeah, there you go. So I just want to highlight some top-level differences that we're seeing between the sort of collective northern ecoregions and the southern ones, which are in yellow and orange there. And they sort of align with our expectations, but it's nice to see it borne out in the data. And so in general, the southern forests, when they burn, this is mostly Saskatchewan, but also Alberta and Manitoba, they tend to be younger, they tend to have less black spruce, more pre-fire above ground carbon, less pre-fire below ground carbon, shallower burn depth, but also less residual below ground carbon, a higher amount of above ground carbon combusted, and therefore a smaller percentage of combustion from below ground. So it's neat to see these differences, and it's not all the same across the region in terms of fire carbon dynamics. Next slide, please. So this is also a paper being led by Zanti. It's in Review in Nature Climate Change, and the whole point is to use this database to try to understand the drivers of combustion. So what is, there's a lot of heterogeneity or variability in combustion, and what's driving that. And so she and we collectively have been using structural equation modeling to look at that. I'm not going to go through these relationships, but this is a hypothesized set of relationships that we're looking at. The black lines are positive relationships, and the dotted red lines are negative. And if you flip to the next slide, please, that'll show the actual relationships coming out from the data. It's a bit messy. The thicknesses of the line here correspond to the strength of the relationship, but the top line result here is that if you look at the sort of the variables on the top there, day of burn going into DC, which is drought code. So we've played a lot with these fire weather indices. Drought code is one of them. We've tried others. We've tried reanalysis data. We've tried station data. And at the end of the day, the bottom-up sort of site-level characteristics are just much more dominant in terms of what drives overall emissions. So we're not saying that fire weather indices are not important. I think it's well established they're extremely important for understanding sort of fire potential and spread and burned area. But in terms of the actual carbon that's coming out of these systems, the data is supporting the fact that it's really these bottom-up characteristics in terms of fuel amount and fuel characteristics that are just dominant. Next slide, please. So my group has been doing some spatial upscaling also using this new database. We hadn't exactly planned on it, but in the process came to the conclusion that we needed a new burned area product, in large part because of the existing ones, shown by some examples in the top two panels there, the national fire databases and then the Collection 6 MODIS product. They tend to sort of neglect this fine scale heterogeneity in the landscape that we know is true across a lot of the domains. This is looking at a fire in the taiga shield of Northwest Territories. So our product, which is kind of on the bottom, we're using Landsat, although ultimately the product is at 500 meters. We aggregate a lot of the noise, but we're also accounting for sort of all the non-burnable vegetation or water and barren land that might exist within a pixel, and so we give a percent burn, which we do think will lead to more accurate predictions, and we've sort of validated that to some extent using high resolution imagery and things like that. Next slide, please. And so we're taking that data and we're applying a bunch of different types of models using gridded input to then model combustion across the entire above domain. And this is just looking at performance from a bunch of different models that we've tried. This is cross-validation, repeated 100 times. And the point is we're going with a random forest with the Ranger package as it's sort of consistently outperforming in terms of cross-validation. Next slide, please. And this is kind of hot off the press. There's a poster by Stefano Potter that shows more details on the results. There we go. So we've actually implemented this across the entire domain. I'm now writing up the paper. And on the right, you can see some of the major fire years. The models are derived at Landsat resolution, but then applied at MODIS, in large part because of some missing imagery in places. So you can see the gradient sort of within fire scars, across fire scars, and across regions. And I think it's kind of neat on the left. You can see these are the data aggregated to roughly 50-kilometer grid cells. I had sort of expected this was true, but it's neat to see it come out in the product that we're seeing, on average, higher combustion in Alaska down through the Boreal Cordillera, and then lower combustion in the sort of central Canadian part of the domain. Next slide, please. And so the final science results I want to highlight, this is coming from Jen Balter and colleagues, and it's a paper that should be submitted soon to Nature. It's a really impressive piece of analysis, I think, and the whole idea is to look at post-fire regeneration, look at the resilience of these conifer and black spruce systems, and because the idea that what sort of establishes within the first 5 to 10 years after fire tends to be what dominates for decades until succession may take place, but sometimes fires come through before that, and we're seeing that more and more. So here's the conceptual framework we're using in terms of dominant and subordinate species. You can just go to the next slide. And here's an indication of the sites going into that. So it's across the entirety of Boreal North America. It's over 1,500 sites. And on the top, you can see, the vast majority of these fires are coming through conifer forests, so black spruce, and to some extent jack pine and white spruce forest. When those conifer species don't reestablish, the top panels show what typically does. And it goes from sort of aspen and birch in the west, and then as you move east, it transitions more to jack pine. Next slide, please. And then here's just an indication of that. So the high-level science result here is that we're sort of saying that black spruce seems to be losing its resilience. That it has quite a bit of categories here that are not self-replacement. So the yellows and orange indicate species turnover, either regeneration failure, poor establishment, or competition. And then you can go and you can zoom in, okay, well then why is that happening? What species are taking over? And it's kind of similar to the map I just showed, but in the west it tends to be birch and aspen, and as you move east it becomes more and more jack pine. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then the final thing I just want to say is that, those were sort of established a couple of years ago. They're reaching maturity. The papers are coming out. I think that's all exciting. It's been really wonderful to be a part of that. I think it's one of the benefits of something like Above, that these syntheses are promoted. It really makes that type of synthesis science possible. So it's been really exciting. And I think we should keep thinking about syntheses going on into the future. And so there's an idea led by Laura Burgos-Chavez and Tatiana Loboda to do a tundra fire synthesis. I don't know, Laura, if you're on the line and your mic is on, you can unmute, you could jump in here. Otherwise, go ahead.
So it's really led by Tatiana, and Xanthi had stepped up to do this. So originally, the idea was to have tundra fire a part of the combustion synthesis, but then it got to be too much, and so it was just a focus on boreal. And so now we realize there's a gap here. So we need to look at the tundra fire and get, if anybody has data, to synthesize it. I think some of it already was provided back at the workshop in 2017, but it just needs to be picked up and started again. And everyone's been super busy, so I think, I don't know if Tatiana's on the line, but she might be able to say something more about it.
Well, maybe not, but yeah, I mean, we can talk more about it tomorrow. I think it'd be really exciting. It's definitely a big data gap, and we're seeing more and more tundra fires. So
I just unmuted Tatiana if you want to say something.
So this is Tatiana. I am on the line, and I just was able to unmute myself. As Laura mentioned, this is in the works. The COVID-19 and other stuff has just really slowed us down, but we are going to pick it up as soon as possible. So wait for the telephone call or email, more likely, within the next couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks.
Okay.
that's it.
Thank you all. Yeah, that was great. This is one area of above, one of several that's really pushed things forward. So thank you all for doing so. And I do think we have to move along. And we do have several questions that we'd like to do on them later, perhaps if we have time at the end. So next up is vegetation dynamics and distribution, and we'll hear from Howie Epstein.
I had to make a switch from computer audio to good old-fashioned phone line, but I think we did that successfully. Do we have the slides? Yeah, okay. This is the Vegetation Dynamics Distribution Working Group, led by myself and Brendan Rogers, and we're going to give an update and some syntheses. At my last count, we had 31 projects involved and 87 individual members in the working group. Next slide, please. So with regard to update, I did a collection of some recent publications by folks in the working group. These are papers that are published in press or submitted. A couple of papers, Burgo Chavez and Idle et al. The Burgo Chavez is the ecosystem map of the Great Slave Lake that is published at the DAC. And the Idle et al. And McGuire et al. Papers on evergreen needle-leaf canopies, the first one in global change biology with remote sensing, evaluating wood growth in evergreen needle-leaf trees. That's global change biology. And the other one on functional relationship between fluorescence and yield in evergreen needle-leaf forests in geophysical research letters. Chris Powder's group, 2 papers, one published, one in press, changes in vegetation phenology and productivity in Alaska, and also vegetation cover in the Yukon River drainages. And then the last one on here is Boyd et al., and that was submitted to Global Change Biology, looking at declines in productivity of aspen as a result of a leaf miner outbreak. Next slide, please. So a few of the updates came with some figures. Next slide. Yeah, okay. So this is recently published by Matt McAndrew et al. In the special above issue of VRL, looking at lichen cover mapping for caribou ranges in Alaska and the Yukon. And you can see from the results that the map does quite well, modeled lichen cover as a function of observed lichen cover, and there's a good relationship there. And the importance of this is related to caribou feeding selection. They strongly select landscapes that have a relatively high fractional lichen cover. You can see that their probability of selection increases to about 30% and then levels off. So the caribou are looking for landscapes that have at least 30% of lichen cover. Next slide, please. The next slide coming up is a paper that is in revision at Nature Communications. by Logan Berner et al., looking at the greening and browning in the across the tundra biome using Landsat data. Really interesting results here that show that the proportion of the tundra landscape that has significant browning trends is actually quite small, 3 to 4%, and the significant greening trends are about 15 to 30% of the landscape, depending on your time frame. That's another key result here, is that if you change the time frame from the full length of the record to the more recent record, there are fewer sites or fewer locations around the tundra that have experienced greening over that period of time. Next slide. So the final paper update is a paper that was submitted to Nature Climate Change by John Wang et al., showing that disturbances suppress the carbon sink, at least the above ground biomass carbon sink in North American boreal forests. And if you take a look at the figures, you see that the net above ground biomass change continues to decrease over time following disturbances. So all this is really, really interesting work and great contributions. Next slide, please. With regard to syntheses, there's actually been quite a lot done with regard to vegetation dynamics over the past probably about a year and a half. The first is a Myers-Smith et al. Paper that was in Nature Climate Change, just recently published, The Complexity of the Greening of the Arctic. Another paper that actually just came out is by Allison Beamish et al., and that's in Remote Sensing the Environment, and that had a pretty strong contribution by above team members. That paper looks at recent trends and remaining challenges for optical remote sensing in Arctic tundra. And then probably two Decembers ago, there was the National Academy of Sciences workshop on high latitude greening and browning. There's a proceedings of that workshop, Understanding Northern Latitude Vegetation, Greening and Browning. And a regular contribution is the Tundra Greenness Essay in the Arctic Report Card. This year that was led by above team member J.J. Frost. Next slide, please. So looking at a couple of new synthesis efforts, this is something that a graduate student of mine is working on a greening and browning synthesis from the literature, and with a specific focus on drivers, because I think that while we have a lot of observations, the drivers have yet to receive a great deal of attention. My student Morgan Tassone has reviewed a selection of papers beginning in 1999. The idea is to go through present. She's gone through papers through 2010 so far. 28 studies met the selection criteria, this is particularly for tundra vegetation. Tundra vegetation, remote sensing observations, field observations, or experiments. This is not modeling is not included in here. Of those 28 studies, she found 107 evidence points, and you can see the distribution on the graph there. With a very large fraction of those evidence points leaning toward greening and much fewer with regard to browning or no change. Next slide, please. And this is the graph that shows the drivers. And if we look at the drivers of greening, we see that increased temperature is a large majority of at least the suggested drivers of tundra greening. Following increased temperatures, increased nutrient availability, and the interaction between increased temperature and increased nutrient availability. And then you can see some of the drivers of browning, decreased insolation, elevation gradients, increased snow cover, et cetera. Next slide, please. And I also want to point out that the Vegetation Dynamics and Distribution Working Group is contributing to the multi-disturbance synthesis that you're going to hear about, I think, next from Adriana Foster. And vegetation dynamics plays a strong role in the synthesis because we're looking at vegetation over time following disturbances, and our group is particularly focused on permafrost-related disturbances. Things like cryoturbation, ice wedge degradation, thaw slumps, other types of thermokarst. Next slide, please. I think that's all, actually. The next slide is a placeholder for synthesis topics to be determined. And I think we have a few. Oh, sorry. Yeah, you had a few animations there that you had to get through. Anyway, yeah. So we have additional syntheses to be determined. There's some work. There's a potential synthesis on boreal forest dynamics. I think the people who are involved there are waiting for more information, for more data to be collected during phase 2. We talked about synthesis of super sites, where we have sites that have a really strong collection of field data time series that we can compare with remote sensing time series from a variety of different resolutions. And then I was really encouraged by Chip Miller's comment the other day. I think it was, I can't remember, it was Monday or Tuesday. But I think we have a lot of work that's going on right now on ecosystem functionality. And with regard to projects that include SIF, solar-induced fluorescence. We have the work by Phil Townsend on functional traits, lots of work on plant functional types, and our affiliated project on ecosystem functional types. So that might be an area that ecosystem functioning with regard to vegetation productivity might be an area that's right for synthesis in the future. And that's all I have.
Thanks, Howard. Yeah, that's a great summary with a lot of exciting research and advances going on. I'm impressed with you and the last speakers are rattling off Nature and Nature Communications and Nature Pharmaceuticals publications coming out left and right, so that's quite nice. Okay, yeah, we do have some questions, but again, I'll have to postpone those a bit till the end of the session so we have time for them. So next up is Paul Montesano, focused on history and
Hi, everybody. I'm Paul Montesano here, and I'm here to talk about the synthesis activity that's being carried out by a loose collective known as the Vegetation Structure and Function Working Group. This group is co-led by myself and de facto co-lead Matt McAnder. So this working group is small. Some but not all the names are listed up there. And because of this, we thought that a good way for us to contribute to the broader above team is to carry out a sort of a well-constrained activity that would likely be widely useful. So our goal through this synthesis work is to produce a set of analysis-ready stacked raster grids of the above archive of Elvis airborne LiDAR data. So these data were collected in the summer airborne campaigns of 2017 and 2019, as Chip talked about the other day. So here you can see a map showing the gridded 2017 and 2019 vegetation height data from Elvis, set against the elevation hillshade in the above domain. These Elvis data, as you can see on the map, they don't exist without work done to process the level 2 flight line data sets to what NASA calls the level 3 gridded products. That are these level 2 data are available through Earth data.nasa.gov, NSIDC, and the above science guide. So the Vegetation Structure Working Group is doing this work to turn these level 2 data sets into level 3 grids and make them available to the above team. Next slide, please. We think these analysis-ready grids will help push forward planned and unplanned and unanticipated collaborations, sort of what Natalie a few minutes ago talked about, and also ease the integration of airborne data into models, something that Josh Fisher explained on day one. That's particularly important. So we'll note that these grids will be snapped to the above 30-meter grid, so hopefully that'll be particularly useful. So what are the steps involved in the synthesis activity? We plan on enriching the ELVIS L2 data set, adding a footprint level canopy cover estimate. We're gridding the data, so converting the level 2 footprint points to analysis-ready stacked GeoTIFF raster grids. We'll be making the code available, the code that we use to grid the data. We'll be making that available, basically R and Bash script. And we'll stage this data on the above science cloud, so anybody in the team can access it relatively easily. So how are we doing this? Basically, we're taking the ELVIS 2 data and as they exist in a tabular form, and using R and Bash scripts to run across hundreds of processes on a DAP2 process to convert the column metrics of the forest structure into these spatial grids. Regarding the data enrichment, we're coordinating with John Armstrong and others on the JEDI science team to be able to apply their code that they've developed for JEDI waveforms to the ELVIS waveforms. ELVIS is the JEDI airborne simulator. In order to extract more information on the horizontal forest structure, such as cover and plant area, and those will complement the vertical structure that you already get. So we hope to apply this code to the entire ELVIS above archive to enrich the existing data sets with these structural attributes. And again, these horizontal, the new enriched data sets or layers will complement existing metrics. Next slide, please. So what does these data look like? So this is sort of just a summary for those who haven't worked with the data but might find it useful. Here you're seeing 30-meter pixels of ELVIS RH98 canopy height data. As shown on top imagery, that's resolving individual trees. This is in Talkeetna, Alaska. These pixels represent the mean of spatially adjacent footprints within pixel boundaries, right? So they're sort of an aggregation of the level 2 data. The footprints are about 10 meters in diameter, and they hold detail in the vertical dimensions of forest as waveforms. So they're capturing the detail at the very top of the canopy down through the subcanopy to the ground surface. This LiDAR data is not like discrete return that provides spatially detailed point clouds, so it's not like G-Light. By the way, G-Light data is available already as analysis-ready grids through their fantastic data discovery interface at glight.nasa.gov. So that's a nice way to get G-Light data, a very, very straightforward way. And so this example here just shows a site in Talkeetna, Alaska. The center is actually my uncle's house with the pond that I used to swim in the middle there. And this is a municipality that has been engaged in a lot of work towards understanding forest resources to carefully plan sustainable use of timber and as a renewable resource. So simple forest height and cover maps, grids like this, could be useful to these types of stakeholders who are working closely with their forests. Next slide, please. So the grids are much more accessible to people outside the immediate science community. So just a quick review, a refresher, what is ELVIS data? Just a conceptual diagram here to remind us of, that the ELVIS is sort of a native footprint level measurement. And within each footprint, you get sort of this continuous waveform that describes the vertical column within the footprint. The level 2 ELVIS data features geolocated surface elevations and canopy height metrics. There are two versions of these level 2 data. There's a classic version and a facility version. And basically, from what I understand, we want the facility version of the data. And that's the version of the data that we'll be processing and making available. That's about 10-meter diameter footprints spaced about 10 meters apart. So it has a little bit of a denser sampling and a smaller footprint than the classic. So we'll be making available the facility version. Next slide, please. So these gridded ELVIS data stacks have extensive coverage across the above domain, as probably a lot of you know by now, which in addition to the detailed vertical structure info, is a really fantastic and kind of a unique feature of this data set. So it's really rare to have such a geographically extensive LiDAR data set like this across, remote boreal landscapes. So in Elvis 2017 data, the grids by sort of our calculation covered about 210,000 square kilometers. Elvis 2019, we haven't calculated it yet, but I don't know, maybe twice as much. It's more than Elvis 2017, so that's really exciting. For reference, G-Light 2014 data in the Shenandoah Valley covered about 100,000 square kilometers, I think. 2018 data, we don't have it all processed yet, but there may be about 500 square kilometers that are accessible right now, though there's much more coming. So there are places where these Elvis grids cross over with G-Light LiDAR within the above domain, which is useful, and it provides an opportunity to understand the differences in these two types of LiDAR acquisitions for VEG. So next slide, please. So a number of us in the working group have started looking at the relationship of this gridded Elvis data with G-Light. So that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at the relationship of Elvis relative height and 98th percentile of the relative height metric versus the G-Light canopy height model. And so you're seeing a little bit of difference, and that's because there are two different data sets, and so it's sort of good to understand that. And I kind of am presenting this to have people recognize that. Because the Elvis grids are ready for analysis, planned and newly formed collaborations will lie on these data, and therefore, projects can hopefully move more swiftly into science objectives without spending time pre-processing the data. So that's all I have right now. So I'm just going to recap on what I've said. This working group is going to be gridding the Elvis 2017 and the recently released Elvis 2019 data. We've actually done that, and so that's ready to be delivered to the Above Science Cloud. So the Elvis 2019 data came out, I think last week, the facility burst. So we've gridded that at 30 meters, and we're ready to move that to the Above Science Cloud, and we think we'll talk to Liz about that. These grids are snapped to the above 30-meter grid. The R code is going to be available, so you can examine how this stuff was made. And sort of the next steps will be to enrich and update the existing grids with a few more horizontal vegetation structure metrics. And so next time, hopefully, we'll talk about some of the unplanned and unanticipated collaborations that have been spawned by these sort of easily accessible data sets. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. And Matt and other members of the working group for pushing this forward. It's really nice to see. And Paul, maybe you could just say real quick, we have several questions, but I don't think we'll be able to get to them, but just real quick, you mentioned that the facility of this 2019 data are available as of last week. Is that correct?
Yes, they became available at Earth Data and at NSIDC, and so we downloaded them to adapt and process them, and so we have the gridded data now. We have it in my sort of personal space, but we'll move it to the Above Science Cloud and let people know when it's there. We want to get this data ready for people now so they have time to use it.
Okay, great. That's awesome. Yes, a lot of people have been waiting for that, I know, and it's great that it's out now.
Hey, Scott, I just want to let people know, because we have so many questions here, that we will collate these questions and get them to the speakers and then post consolidated answers to these questions.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. There are a lot of questions. We just can't take them now. But keep them coming, and we will have the speakers follow up on them. This is great to keep the conversation going. Okay, and then next up, we are running late, is Adriana Foster, who will speak about the multi-disturbance synthesis activities.
Hi, yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, great. All right, so yeah, I'm going to talk about the multi-disturbance synthesis working group, and there are a lot of people on this group who have been working And so not everyone is listed here, and you can always add your name to this list by emailing me or support. Next slide. So the synthesis group came out of a breakout session at the last science team meeting on vegetation disturbance interactions. And so, we all know that disturbances are a dominant driver of vegetation dynamics in boreal and Arctic systems. Next slide. And so some of these disturbances are fairly well studied. For example, within above, there are 48 projects across all the funding years that specifically mention fire in the project description, and we've heard lots of talks this week on fire-related projects. Next. But other disturbances like insect outbreaks, human-related activities, and permafrost degradation and collapse are less well studied. And then there are a few studies that are looking into interactions between disturbances. And we also noticed that there isn't really a good comprehensive review of both Arctic and boreal disturbances within the literature. Next. So to that end, we plan to create a synthesis of the main disturbances, both natural and anthropogenic, within the North American Arctic and boreal regions. And so specifically, we're planning to summarize each disturbance or disturbance type, including the causes, precursors, and vulnerabilities, as well as the impacts on vegetation structure, composition, productivity, and dynamics. And so we want to look at case studies for each disturbance and look at remote sensing derived indicators of pre-disturbance vulnerability and post-disturbance recovery. And then we additionally wanted to focus on disturbance interactions and their impacts, as well as future needs for further study of each disturbance in terms of data or tools. Next. So here are all the disturbance types and groups. So we have fire, pests and pathogens, wind throw, lots of permafrost or hydrology-related disturbances, a handful of anthropogenic-related disturbances, as well as drought-related disturbances. And so each of these topics has a lead with several group members that have been working on their portion of the synthesis, and most of the group members sort of are working on more than one disturbance type. Next. And so this is an interesting figure that J.J. Frost made for this synthesis. So he did an NNDS ordination on all the different disturbances we were focusing on using different spatial, temporal, and intensity characteristics. And so the x-axis here, the graph is the result of sort of preliminary results for his ordination. And so the x-axis is the size gradient for the disturbance, and the y-axis is the frequency and intensity gradient. So intensity would be increasing, sort of going down, and return interval is increasing, going up. And so we can see that we're studying these disturbances, they're spanning the ranges of all of these different metrics. And so it's going to be a really interesting review to sort of compile and look at how all of these different disturbances impact vegetation dynamics differently. Next. So I'm just going to show some preliminary findings from some of our case studies. So we've been compiling case study points based on knowledge and data from members of the working group. And at each of these points, John Wang has pulled median summer values for various vegetation indices. Next. So I'm just going to show some preliminary results. So for fire, we have 9 case study points so far. And because we're interested in post-disturbance recovery, sort of as a first pass look at that, I normalized each value to the pre-disturbance mean. So here we can see the mean values across all of our case study points in black, and then with the individual points in colors behind them. And I'm showing NDVI on the left and NDMI on the right. And the x-axis is years since disturbance, with the disturbance event occurring at that year 0. So for fire, we can see a very obvious drop in both metrics and then a gradual recovery in both. And interestingly, for NDVI, we can see that it actually increases for some of them to above the pre-disturbance mean after about 15 to 20 years, which may be due to changes in vegetation composition. Next. So for the permafrost-related disturbances, the signals are more mixed. So you can just click through those. For prioritization, for example, shows a mixed NDVI signal wedge degradation shows an increase in NDVI, whereas the drainage is also mixed between the Alaska site and then the Yukon site in green. And then finally, for our thaw slump site, we have a decrease in NDVI, and the thermokarst site doesn't really show up much. Next. And so here are those same sites showing the NDMI trajectories where the patterns are somewhat similar. And again, these are just preliminary results that we will be diving into in the coming weeks and months. And I was sort of particularly struck by the difference in how dramatic and sort of obvious the changes were for fire, but for the permafrost-related disturbances, they're a lot more nuanced. Next. So for logging, we have a number of locations in Canada that show a decline in both NDVI and NDMI in the year of logging, and then an increase in those metrics above the pre-logging mean. And again, this could be due to changes in vegetation composition. Next. And finally, we have a number of locations from Elizabeth Campbell over areas that experience spruce and mountain pine beetle outbreaks. So the top two graphs show the NDVI progression, which doesn't really show much change, with even an increase in NDVI in the spruce beetle plot on the left. And on the bottom, we can see the NDMI progression, which shows a decline before and right after the outbreak. And so this NDVI increase, we're thinking that's likely due to increase in the productivity of non-attacked trees as they're sort of released following the mortality of other trees. Whereas the NDMI decrease is likely due to the response of the attacked trees. So many bark beetle attacked trees close their stomata once they're infested, and that would result in moisture stress and decreased transpiration over the canopy. So there's a lot to dive into. Next. So looking to the future for this synthesis, we plan to develop an analysis framework for comparing across the disturbance types. We also want to look into creating biomass and vegetation composition space for time substitutions for each disturbance type. We also will be compiling our case study sites for disturbance interactions analysis. And as for our conceptual framework, we really want to look into the recovery rates and patterns across all the disturbances and investigate why and how they may differ. Next. And then so our planned deliverables so far are a unified database of above disturbances, a large review paper outlining our synthesis and case studies. And then we also have some smaller papers planned, such as a permafrost-focused paper, one on disturbance interactions, as well as one focused on biogeography and climate impacts on the differences in post-disturbance recovery. So yeah, we have a lot planned for the future. If you're interested in joining, you can email me or you can email support asking to join the listserv. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Adriana. That was a great quick run-through on that. I saw on a separate thread, parallel thread going on, that you're interested in having potentially having a breakout tomorrow.
Oh yeah, I thought we could do an insect breakout tomorrow since it's been very fire focused. I guess, yeah. But that would not just be for the most disturbance synthesis. It could be, and anyone who's interested.
Okay, yeah, I think that would be great. We reserved tomorrow for people to do just these kind of things, and I will defer to Peter and the support group for setting those up. But we basically have the channels open for you to do that. So you could follow up on that, and I'm sure we can arrange it. And there is a poster session as well tomorrow, so we can do these things in parallel. Okay, so we are running behind. We did go in a little bit discussion time, but I think we have already blown through that. So it's probably good just so that we don't run too late here, that we just keep moving. Next up is Kevin Schaefer, who will do a presentation on the soil moisture and active layer thickness data synthesis. What's going on?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, Scott?
Yep.
All right. My name is Kevin Schaefer, and I've been leading a team to try to integrate data from all the different areas or field sites into a gigantic validation data set consisting of active layer and thickness and soil moisture. I'd like to thank all the teams that have kindly given us their data and measurements or taken measurements for us. I'd like to extend a broad thank you to Laura Boudreau Chavez for seemingly endless patience in what I can only describe as a very tedious and arduous process of integrating all this data. Next slide, please. Our ultimate goal is to try to get validation data for all 66 flight lines where we can apply our data processing techniques. This is pretty hard. I'm not sure we can do this, and we obviously can't visit every single one of these sites to do field work. So we've been asking various teams in these flight lines to take measurements or provide data. Next, please. These white stars represent the data that we already have in our validation data set. Next, please. These red stars indicate data that we have, but we haven't integrated into the data set. Now, to get you an idea what I'm talking about, you can't just throw the data into a data set because everyone seems to use different structures, spreadsheets, nomenclature, units, et cetera, so you've got to do a lot of massaging. It takes about 5 hours on average to do one data set, although the longest I had to do was 11 hours. That's a lot of time. Anyway, next slide. To give you an idea of what techniques we're actually using, or everybody is using, there's the old standard standby of using the handheld active layer probe. You just stick it in the ground and measure the active layer thickness. Next, we've also been using ground penetrating radar, which emits a signal that reflects off the permafrost table and allows you to measure the active layer thickness. Now this lends itself to being, we have set it up to drag it all over the place and have really long transects of good active layer thickness data that is very well suited for comparison with remote sensing data. Next. Now to get volumetric water content, and by the way, volumetric water content is volume of water per volume of soil. And a lot of people have been using the HydroSense 2 probes. Now, these are 12 or 20 centimeter long probes, and you stick them in the ground, and what you measure is essentially volumetric water content average over that 12 or 20 centimeter depth. So it's a point measurement. Next, please. We have found that if you combine the active layer probe with the active layer GPR measurements, you can get a wave velocity through the active layer from which you can deduce average volumetric water content throughout the depth of the active layer. Next, please. We also have used a dual EM. EM stands for electromagnetic. This is essentially a metal detector, and it gives you a 1 meter wide footprint. Although one of our guys had steel-toed shoes, and whenever he made the measurements, it seemed to screw them up completely. So we had to have them stop doing that. But these also provide a depth average volumetric water content for the active layer. Next, please. Now, to give them an idea of how much data we got, in terms of linear surveys and such, we got about 50 kilometers worth of data with an average spacing between 75 and 100 centimeters. And this is spread over about 100 sites, and we currently cover about 20 of the 66 flight lines. To give you just an overview of what this data looks like, I got a probability density function here of the active layer thickness measurements. We got about 200,000 measurements. On the horizontal axis, you have active layer, and on the vertical axis is the frequency. This is a probability density function. So the percentage of those percentage of total number of points that fall within those bins or ranges. Next, please. We have a lot fewer water content measurements, about 14,000 of them. And on the horizontal axis, you can see volumetric water content, and on the vertical axis, again, this is frequency. Now, you notice an oddity here. We do have measurements that exceed 100%. And you're probably wondering, what on earth is happening? How could it possibly be greater than 100%? And physically, it can't. You have to realize that when you measure the water content, you're not measuring that directly. Next, please. What you're actually measuring with those hydrosense probes is the dielectric constant of the soil. And that's a really good solid measurement. But to get the volumetric water content, you've got to apply what we call the calibration curve. And it happens at really high water contents. The calibration curve can be a little bit off. And so we're investigating that. We're going to see if we have to apply a different calibration curve or something like that. Next, please. Now, this is an example of a validation. I talked about this briefly yesterday. I'll talk a little bit more about it today. But this is at Utqiagvik, or formerly Barrow. And in this first plot, you've got horizontal axis is the validation, or rather the observed values based on our field measurements. And on the vertical axis, you've got what we estimate from our product using the peeping and LPM retrieval. And it actually looks pretty good here. Now, we haven't plotted the uncertainties yet, but the uncertainties will cross the 1-1 line. We do have them, we just haven't plotted them up yet. Next, please. What is not so encouraging is this. On the horizontal axis, you've got the field measurements of activator thickness. On the vertical axis, you've got the retrieved activator thickness. Now, when we did the same validation for satellite-based estimates of activator thickness, they bunched up very nicely right on that 1-1 line. But in this case, with the airborne measurements, they're spread out a lot more. And we figured out what's going on. In the satellite-based measurements, we take the average of a lot of different interferograms from a lot of different scenes, and that tends to really narrow the range of activator thickness. But for above, we've got one interferogram. And next, please. You can see here the ALOS-2 estimate, which is satellite-based, is actually a much narrower distribution than what we're getting for this. Now we're looking at exactly how we can recast the spread of the substance and to try to narrow that spread because we don't think it should be this wide. It's just an artifact of noise within the data that produces that. Next slide, please. Now we're also using this to try to answer some basic science questions, not just validate data. And so what we did, we have about 5,000 or so paired volumetric water content and activator thickness. So we're trying to answer the basic question, what really drives among all the factors, but what really drives active layer thickness? Is it the heat capacity or is it the thermal conductivity? Because this is both driven by soil moisture. The heat capacity, here I'm really talking about latent heat diffusion. And of course, the water content determines the thermal conductivity of the soil, frozen or unfrozen, either way. We plotted this out, and what we see in this plot here is that the more water you have, the shallower the active layer. And this indicates that the heat capacity actually seems to drive it. But this is not a really totally satisfying analysis here because it's what we call the shotgun blast. It's just all these points all over the place. And if you look at the R-squared, yeah, it's marginally statistically significant, but we would like a stronger relationship. So what we did, next please, is we created a two-dimensional probability density function. On the horizontal axis, you get the average volumetric water content over the whole active layer, and we put in bins, and then we created bins for active layer thickness to get this two-dimensional probability density function. And then for each volumetric water content, you pick the maximum value in the PDF, which represents the most likely value of active layer thickness for that volumetric water content. Next, please. And you get a much cleaner relationship. By doing this, essentially what we're doing is trying to get rid of the noise, because this data is naturally quite noisy. And we see, we get the same relationship, but we get a much stronger R squared, and this is, in fact, statistically significant. I wanted to point out that our intern student did this analysis, Leah Clayton, down in the corner there, and I just wanted to point out that she did this as a high school senior, and this is kind of like PhD level work, so she was a very sharp young lady. She's off to Yale this next semester. Next slide, please. Oh, I did want to state, this relationship shows up when you use the depth averaged volumetric water content over the entire active layer. But if you look just at the 12 or 20 centimeter values, you find there's no relationship at all. It's flat, and nothing is statistically significant. So essentially what that means is, what really matters is the total water content in the active layer, and that there's not a strong relationship between the 12 and 20 centimeter values and what's in the total water column, or total column for the entire active layer. Next, please. All right, next steps is we want to integrate more data. Now, we do have a lot of data right now, and there's a bunch of data sets that we're still integrating in. It's a very laborious process. But we do want to integrate more data, and we do plan to publish this data set. I could tell from seeing all the presentations yesterday and today that this data set could be useful to a lot of people working in the above domain. And so we're going to publish this data set. We got a little bit of cleanup. We're going to publish it right away before we integrate more data. And then we're going to integrate more data and publish a version 2 later. And I do have a request. I think I've mentioned this at virtually every science team meeting we've had. But if you have active layer thickness or water content observations, we are in fact very interested in trying to use those to validate the radar products. And so that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. So when you say you'll publish the data set, you mean publish and archive or back, is that right?
Yes, publish it means put it in correct format and give it to the DAC, get a DOI for it, make sure all the contributors have co-authorship credit, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, publish it on the Oak Ridge DAC.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, that's awesome. We do have another question for you, but we have to move along. So next up is, thank you, and next up is John Kimball. And John said I encourage people to keep asking questions because we are archiving all this and questions will get answered. So keep them coming. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So this is John Kimball. I'm going to talk about hydrology and permafrost synthesis activities. What I've got listed here is just a small subset of the folks that have been active lately in this activity. Next slide. So kind of coming out of the last working group, we had a breakout activity and kind of moving from phase 1 to phase 2 activities. We identified 3 synthesis activities to carry forward. That included looking at patterns and trends of thermokarst activity or patterns across the above domain, looking at variations in active layer properties over really emphasizing foundational flight lines or legacy lines for the airborne radar, where we had multiple years of observations at key seasonal snapshots over the annual cycle, and then emphasizing upscaling of those observations using kind of aggregations of diverse field observations and diverse airborne data collections, including the STAR data, as well as satellite observations and modeling. And then the third one was looking at how our understanding of hydrologic connectivity of boreal Arctic rivers, lakes, and wetlands is changing based on some of the new observations that have been coming out of the project. And so all of these activities are really emphasizing above data products, are really enabled by those data products. These activities also have traceability to the above implementation plan that were highlighting kind of the science priorities within the hydrology focus group. That includes processes controlling changes in permafrost distribution of properties, looking at the causes and consequences of hydrologic changes, including water storage, movement, and distributions. And then also looking at water carbon energy cycle coupling and impact on ecosystem properties. These activities are also clearly cross-cutting with other working groups, including snowscapes. Bambi reported on that, disturbance activities from both Howie and Adriana. Their reports today, modeling and carbon dynamics, as well as the basic data collections and validation activities that Kevin's talked about. These activities, the three activities we've identified here, are still in the early implementation stages, and so anybody who's interested in these things can contact either myself or David Buttman or the actual activity leads for participation. Next slide. So just in terms of the thermokarst patterns and processes, Tor Jorgensen is leading on this activity. Their primary objectives are really to look at thermokarst landforms from kind of a literature overview and characterizing those landforms at different spatial scales, emphasizing a hydrology perspective, trying to quantify the extent and decadal trends of the dominant features and drivers of these patterns, and then identifying and communicating priorities at the different scales. And their deliverables are really looking at one or more publications that include kind of a literature review assessment of these patterns, and then a geodatabase of thermokarst locations at different scales over the above domain. Next slide. The second activity is this active layer properties and upscaling activity. This is being led by Matamagadam and myself. The objectives here are really to characterize, again, emphasizing these legacy SAR lines across northern Alaska, where we've got multiple years of SAR observations, but we've also got other types of synergistic observations from other airborne platforms, satellite observations that kind of cover the entire domain more continuously in time and space, as well as a diverse set of field observations that have been collected over the last several years. To try to link those observations and airborne snapshots to try to develop more broad-scale landscape geospatial layers where we're characterizing the change in active layer properties both in space but at different spatial scales, and then trying to identify or communicate those key drivers and controls affecting the active layer trends. And then from this activity, this upscaling activity, trying to develop organizational protocols for optimal upscaling. And the idea here is to try to inform our system models or dynamic global vegetation models in terms of characterizing or somehow preserving that subgrid scale variability that's most critical for looking at water carbon energy coupling. The deliverables we're looking at here is a publication looking at just a theoretical overview of past research from the literature on multi-frequency and multi-mode radar retrievals of active layer properties, as well as new opportunities for deriving enhanced products, particularly stemming from above activities. Another publication will be looking at a random forest type empirical approach for spatial upscaling and time and space upscaling of active layer properties, and then using the results of that upscaling process and the regression trees to identify, empirically anyways, the key predictors and control factors as a means for informing more process-oriented models in terms of potential missing processes or linkages that are not represented in those other model types. And then new geospatial data from that random forest upscaling approach that would have active layer properties associated with it. And that would be a data product that will be put out to the ORNL DAC. Next slide. And the third activity here is being led by Tamlin Pavelski and John Mallard. And what the interest here is really looking at reviewing the physical characteristics of boreal Arctic rivers, lakes, and wetlands in terms of their connectivity, both in time and spatial connectivity, and how those connections are changing. Looking at the results of past studies to try to draw conclusions about how this connectivity is changing and then projected to potentially change into the future. The key deliverables they're looking at for this activity will be a publication that kind of synthesizes what we know now based on our understanding of the connectivity among lakes, rivers, and wetlands across the above domain, and how it's changed and how it's changing in the future. And again, these types of synthesis activities will be emphasizing a lot of the recent data collections obtained through the above, and this is just illustrating some of the recent stuff through the air squat campaigns, but there's other data associated with this as well that will be used for this analysis. Next slide. And finally, this is just a plug for several posters that are part of the meeting here that are contributing to these activities that are within the HPWG working group. And with that, I'll go ahead and leave it off.
Thanks, John. Great. Man, it's painful to rush through these things because there's so much great work being presented here after so much preparation. But do need to move along, just in the interest of trying to keep somewhere on schedule. So next up is Abhishek Chatterjee, who will be presenting on the carbon synthesis activities.
Thanks, Scott. Hello, everyone. So I'm just going to give a quick summary and overview of the carbon synthesis activity that kind of has been going on under the auspices of the Carbon Dynamics Working Group. So the Carbon Dynamics Working Group is actually, it's a pretty large group and involves a huge number of projects from the phase 1, the airborne, and now the recent phase 2 project. And the people who are listed here do not necessarily they're part of the carbon dynamics, but they're a very small subset. And we expect that this list of people will be growing as more and more phase 2 projects kind of join in this activity. This is a very small subset of people who have been meeting and talking regularly in trying to move some of the topics that I'll mention, trying to move those along. Now, sort of the two groups of people that I would like to give a shout out to is Megan McGrody and Peter Griffith and the support team who have been really instrumental in helping us collate and gather some data sets that I'll mention in a minute. And the ADAPT team, Mary Aron and Mark Carroll, who have sort of set up a very nice space for us to kind of get some of the large modeling outputs or some of the data sets and also help us recreate some of them or helping us recreate some of them to the above domain. And then also a shout out to our new summer interns, Geraldine, Shannon, and Elsa. I think all three of them are in the attendee list. So they are going to be working with us over the summer, and actually thanks to Hank and headquarters for providing us with funds. But the idea is that they'll be helping, they're all extremely smart, talented students who are moving on to PhDs in their respective institutions, and they'll all be helping us a little bit with some of the analysis. So I just wanted to mention that in case you see them in ether or hear from them, then do say hi to them. Next slide, please. So the background for this carbon synthesis activity, I think it was sort of scoped out a bit at a breakout session at the last meeting in La Jolla. We actually had ended up with like a master list of topics that people wanted to explore or look at, and I had that list at the very last slide. However, not all of those kind of took off. And I think it was primarily dependent upon volunteers to sign up for a particular activity and lead them. What ended up happening is sort of these three synthesis focus areas that I've mentioned here. Those are the three activities that kind of picked up steam, and I'll sort of giving a bit more details about them and some of the early results from them in a minute. So one focused on looking at the carbon budget for the above domain. A second one primarily focused on looking at methane fluxes and model data mismatch. And trying to identify what the current knowledge gaps are and what kind of challenges we have. And a third one on looking at carbon climate feedbacks and how the carbon cycle responds to disturbances. Now, each of these synthesis topics kind of has its own temporal extent. So, for example, whether the carbon budget looks at a decadal time period, whereas the carbon climate feedback looks at multiple decades. But all of these activities are kind of going on at full steam right now, and actually it's kind of pretty exciting to sort of see some of the initial results. Before moving on, I just wanted to again talk about some of the data providers, sort of give a big thanks to the data providers and Megan McGrody for contacting them and collating a lot of the data set. This is something that's a work in process and covers a range of environmental and physical drivers. And our hope is that once this is, the carbon activity, as it progresses and it's getting wrapped up, then this data sets will all be available on ADAPT. They will be reformatted and regridded to the above grid, and then that will spawn off newer collaborations and newer synthesis activities. This, I think, will go very well with some of the other data sets that we already heard about from Kevin and others. Because I think it sort of provides a nice complementary suite to those. Next slide, please. So just quickly kind of for each of the synthesis topics, since for several of you this is the first time that you might be hearing about them or seeing them, I have a very simple framework that I'll just kind of introduce what we're trying to achieve or what the driving questions are for a particular topic, and then sort of how we are planning to tackle it and some initial results and what the next steps are. So for the carbon budget, I think it's sort of very simple driving questions in terms of trying to look at the carbon balance, understanding or trying to do a reconciliation of the top-down and bottom-up flux estimates. And then as we are looking at a decadal period from 2009 to 2018, then as the carbon budget is responding to changing with changes to the environment, then what kind of responses do we see, whether there is any difference in different regions within the above domain. If you click next. And so to progress or to sort of progress on this particular topic, we are looking at the carbon budget through through a synthesis of three types of flux estimates. So the first group is what I'm calling as data-driven, which is scaled up from direct observations of carbon exchange in the atmosphere. So think in terms of like flux towers or eddy covariance data. The second group is from bottom-up process-based models, and a third down from top-down atmospheric inversion models. This is sort of actually very similar to what Dave McGuire has done for Alaska through different recap or global carbon policy activities. And I've had couple of discussions with Dave, and he has been extremely interested in this activity and sort of guiding it. So the conversations, he sort of has really helped in shaping or guiding on what are the key questions or sort of the key analysis that we can set up. And sort of shown on the left plot here is some of the very first results in trying to look at what the seasonal cycle is from from these three different groups. This is kind of aggregated over the above domain, and so the trendy model, basically there are like 8 or 9 different models, so it has a huge range. But at least with the top-down atmospheric inversions or the data-driven ones, we do see there sort of at least some consistency, although there is quite a bit, almost a phase shift for the spring up drawdown. But what we are interested in is that now breaking up the above domain furthermore into these smaller regions or the ecoregions. It's a very nice map from John Wang. So the idea would be to look at both the seasonal cycle and generate the carbon budget for each of these individual ecoregions. So that's sort of like the work that's currently in progress, or sort of the next steps. Next slide. So the second synthesis topic that is happening is led by Roisin and Jenny Watt. And that sort of primarily looks at understanding the different knowledge gaps or model data mismatch related to methane. And some of the big questions that they're trying to understand is like where and why do the models results agree or disagree, and then doing a similar emission budget analysis for methane. Next. And these are some of sort of the high-level questions that they are interested in. For example, evaluating a model's methane fluxes versus atmospheric observation using atmospheric transport model over this domain, and then investigating where and why these models do not match observations and where we need to focus to improve those. One of the outcomes or deliverables from this would be to provide the code and observations that are very used and some of those error analysis in a nice open source package. So hopefully that sort of provides a template for future type of activities. And the figure here is just like a conceptual setup of, for example, when you take aircraft observations and you have some sort of observed enhancement that is shown in the red arrow. You then have some kind of bottom-up model estimate or simulate some type of flux estimate, and then you move those to a transport model to sort of generate the enhancement and sort of how the mismatch between those observed and simulated enhancements, how they vary by different regions. So this is again sort of in progress, and for questions I would point you directly towards Roisin and Jenny. Next slide. The third topic that's underway is led by Nick Parazu and Nima Madani, and that sort of looks at carbon climate feedback to the response of the carbon cycle to disturbance. Sort of one of the primary questions that they are looking at here is, can we see different trends in carbon fluxes, and furthermore, can we disentangle them based on the impact of disturbance effect versus climate and CO2 fertilization effect? Sort of what they had started off primarily first is looking at how the plant post-fire recovery in this domain, and then what processes drive the GPP recovery time and signal. So Nima has done this really nice analysis of significant fire events, which is shown in the left-hand side plot here, and then for each of, and then look at the GPP. This is from the one of the versions of the SMAP level 4 sync product. Again, you should check in with Nima or John about like the exact details of that product. We're sort of looking at the GPT trends and deriving GPT anomalies, and then seeing for specific years where you had the significant fire events, essentially what the main drivers were. Dean actually has like a pretty advanced analysis at this point, and so yeah, absolutely, if you want or interested in further details, then please get in touch with him or Nick. Next slide. So if you're interested and if you want to participate, how you can join this effort, one is that we have a reflector list, the above synthesis carbon. So you can send an email there and ask to join this group. Definitely, we are hoping that a lot of the Project 2 modeling activities, a lot of those team members will be interested in joining. I know several of them mentioned this on the first couple of days, and so that was kind of really exciting to see that people are interested. Or if you are particularly interested in one particular piece of the puzzle here, or one particular synthesis topic, then you can just contact one of us, and we'll make sure to kind of include you as the discussion and the analysis progresses. Next slide. So this is sort of like the master list that we actually had generated at the last Above Science meeting. The 3 topics that I discussed in detail, those were actually part of this list. And as I said, we essentially had volunteers who were willing to sign up for those topics and lead them. So I kind of have put future with a question mark here because I'm hoping that we can turn this around into some type of synthesis topic, especially since some of these are already underway as part of individual projects. So for example, both the first few, the seasonal amplitude of CO2 concentration, is something that Gretchen and Brendan and those people have talked about a lot and looking at. Then partitioning of net ecosystem exchange, again, Lei mentioned this in detail on day 1. So some of these work is already underway, and I'm thinking that there is an opportunity here that these can be sort of expanded into a little bit broader, where different models and different observations can be included, or different projects can be included to turn them around. And then we also have a bunch of synthesis topics that were suggested, which would be cross-cut with different working groups. Hydrology and permafrost, especially looking at carbon fluxes in permafrost ecosystems and sort of how they change as you go and look at different scales from local to regional. Freeze-thaw dynamics and timing impact on CO2 CH4 fluxes. I think John did mention this. That's one of the potential topics that can be looked at. And then there are a lot of overlap actually with modeling working group, which you'll hear in a minute from Josh. I actually have covered just a couple here, but in all honesty, I think there is a huge cross-cut between some of the carbon cycle topics and the modeling topics. And then finally, there were also discussions about looking at twinning drowning trends and the ATC productivity, and which we earlier heard from Howie and others that there is also like quite a bit of work going there. But again, carbon cycle is sort of ever present in all of these different working groups, and so I think any type of analysis that is going on there by looking at disturbance or the bed dynamics, that will have an impact on the carbon cycle. So the other announcement that I had to make was that I was aware that we would be most likely running late, so we wouldn't have a lot of time left for discussion. So we have a Thursday breakout session slot from 4 to 5 p.m., which is tomorrow, 4 to 5 p.m. So if you are interested in sort of discussing either the topics that are currently ongoing, so the 3 topics I mentioned earlier, or sort of signing up to work on one of these topics, or if you have other topics that you would like to propose, then please join us tomorrow from 4 to 5 p.m. That's where I'm hoping that we can have a lot more open discussion and dialogue. Thank you. That's all from my side.
Excellent. Thank you, Abhishek. It was impressive, and I continue to be impressed with the scope and the depth of the activities that you're engaged in, how organized you are. It's quite nice to see. I wish we had 30 minutes to delve into all this in a break session or an hour, but unfortunately we need to move along, and we'll have a little bit of time maybe at the end to discuss some of this. But our final synthesis working group activity summary is from Josh Fisher, who I'm sure has something good to serve up.
Hey, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, so I'm Josh Fisher, representing the modeling working group, the last, the dessert of this wonderful multi-course meal of working group reports. And some of you might be quite full of information, but there's always room for dessert. So the members of the modeling working group are on the left. I don't have a picture of us, although we more or less look like the picture that is there, although that is not actually us. So to be clear, the guy holding that dog is not Kevin Schaefer. Although I think the guy in the middle might be Sean Surgeon or Ben Poulter. I haven't seen those guys in a while. So feel free to reach out to me if you would like to be on the list, or if you are too embarrassed to be on the list and would like to be taken off. So with my 7 minutes, I have basically 2 slides, which is the essentially menu of different synthesis topics we've been discussing. Next slide. And very high level, a lot of it's been discussed by the other working groups with the syntheses. So here is our first page of our 6-course synthesis topics menu for the modeling working group. And we've already heard about the first item on the menu from Abhishek on the bottom-up and top-down models, reconciliation for carbon cycling. And so I don't need to go into that too much, although I do have this listed not only as the title and a little bit of this description, but some of the issues and topics that we've discussed with each of these synthesis topics, like how we deal with differences in resolutions and domains for the different models. And I have some names that go with each of these. People have signed up. So to speak, wine pairing. Not that I'm saying Abhishek is whining about this, but he is a good pairing with this topic. The second topic is basically the state of Arctic boreal region ecosystem processes. The description is that some models have more, quote-unquote, advanced process representation than others, and it's of interest to the scientific community a roadmap of these differences as different models put out different projections and maps of different ecosystem variables and so on. So there's interest in that among the community. No one's quite signed up for it. I think it would make a good first, PhD chapter, or even more like a lit review-based master's thesis. So by all means, sign up for that and let me know. The third topic is on subgrid variability. Basically, we've got a lot of very fine spatial resolution landscape features that drive ecosystem functioning in our Arctic boreal region. And this has a lot of cross-cut synergies with permafrost and hydrology. And so how do different models or different approaches integrate the subgrid variability, and what is the impact of these different approaches? There's a lot of opportunity here for this important aspect of the region. In above, because of remote sensing, we are able to capture a lot of the dynamics with remote sensing, and there's a lot of interesting and important scaling analyses and activities going on from remote sensing data alone that have either synergies or parallels to what can be done in the modeling side. And so there's a lot of interest there. I think NG has been very focused on that,
And so then how can we integrate that throughout above more? And Ben Poltridge and Watts, I think maybe Sean Servin and others would be good contacts on that. Next page. And the last page. This will be the last page. We have a number of models in above that can be grouped into two camps. One which would be these individual-based models, which simulate basically individual trees, and then more plant functional type or trait, moving towards more plant trait-based models. And they're really important and very kind of different from each one from one another. And so what can be learned from one type of modeling type and the other, and how can strengths from each group be combined, and what are the differences? So for like individual-based models, we have models like ED or UVFME, and then parts of those kind of become incorporated into the bigger TFT or trait-based models like CLM, where we have ED or CLM-based in those models. So I was just talking with Adriana Foster in one of our breakout or the after hours breakout groups, and I think she said she and Jackie Schumann were doing a comparison between UVFME and CLM, I think, and Sean and Eric, I can't remember who, but there's interest in the CLM versus the CLM state activity as well. So there's good progress going forward on that menu item. The next one would be on drivers and run protocols, a somewhat kind of boring, standard pasta dish type for the activities, but still, a staple, very important. And it turns out, so there's a lot of modeling activities, and there's a lot of choices that models can use in terms of what weather data and other types of run protocols they can be using. And if there's standardization among different modeling groups and model runs, then the model outputs can be a little bit more comparable with fewer degrees of freedom in terms of what controls the outputs, besides just the process representation and parameterization and so on within the model. This is particularly important. Debbie Hunsinger published a paper earlier this year about the importance of spin-up. And, we're so interested in these future projections or what's been going on over the past century or so on, but just how do you start a model? And that is hugely important on determination of solar carbon stock and solar carbon stock uncertainty. And so that paper really highlights that aspect and motivates this synthesis activity a little bit more. There's a lot of different types of weather data, for example, which I mentioned, like DayNet and OtherNet, for GSWP. I think a lot of the CLM guys have showed that you can get really terrible results with I-line benchmarks when you use one net data set versus another. So it's important to really understand and track that. And so folks like Eric Larson, Nick Parazu, Kevin Schaefer, Andy Fox, and Chen interested in that menu item. And then the final menu item is the synthesis of the above database for models. And I talked a bit about that on day one for my project update. I'm part of the wine pairing here for this menu item, and just kind of deep dive into the entire above database, extraction of functional relationships and benchmarks. But there's other aspects that folks like Dan Hayes, Andy Fox, Sean Servin are interested in working on in terms of using the data for benchmarking, for assimilation, as we heard from Andy and Dave Moore earlier, and so on. So I think that's probably it for my 7 minutes, and gives you a bit of an overview of the different synthesis topics that have been moving forward and being iterated on in the modeling working group. Happy to chat with anyone more on that. Perhaps we can have a breakout group if there's interest. And please feel free to sign up and contribute to any of these or add more. Thanks.
Thank you. I thought there was a whole other page to the menu. Or maybe I'm already onto the digest.
No, yeah. I think you're drinking too much wine. There's only 2 pages.
That's fine. Okay, thank you, Josh. That was excellent. Nice run through. This has been a really great session. I'm sorry we don't have a lot more time to go into each of these in breakout sessions, but such is our situation at the moment, and hopefully we'll be able to remedy that in the future. So I think what, for now, we can probably just move straight into any kind of closing comments from Hank and Mike, and then maybe a little bit about plans for tomorrow for poster sessions and any kind of breakout sessions. And for that, I will rely on Peter and Natalie Sharp and others to give us an update on that. So Hank, did you have any closing comments you'd like to make?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. Yeah, I had my headphones broke during this, but I'd like to just thank everybody for their participation. It's been, as always, hugely interesting, and it's great to see all the wonderful progress you've made. We're about halfway through above, as Scott mentioned on day one. I think we're really at full speed here. It's a mature project. There's an amazing amount of results that are coming through. From a program management perspective, it's always a challenge to kind of keep up with things, be able to synthesize and be able to communicate to others what we've learned. It's obviously a lot, but it's got to be boiled down. We went through the what have we learned exercise a little while ago. I think we got to start coming back to that again. The synthesis presentations were awesome. Thank you so much. The terrestrial ecology program has this tradition of doing field experiments, and the key thing is that we're stronger together than we are individually, and you guys are really showing that. So thanks so much. We would like to reiterate what we've talked about as far as COVID recovery. We're really interested in, making it possible to have a reasonable or even full recovery for the projects, and we'll be following up with that. I guess that's all. I just want to thank you once again and tell you how very impressed I am.
Okay, I just got a couple of things to say, and I agree with everything that Hank said. I mean, it's really great for us to take the time to be able to see all the hard work and excellent things that you guys have been doing, and seeing it all in one place at one time is really a really great thing. When we started, trying to figure out what to do because of COVID and moving this from a in-person meeting to a virtual meeting, I was pretty stressed out and nervous about it. And I just really want to thank, number one, the planning committee for being open to this idea about doing a virtual meeting, and then really strategizing to come up with some of the most effective ways to do it in terms of the agenda. And then really, I guess, I really want to thank Peter and his group. So Peter, Liz, Libby, Sarah, Natalie, I'm forgetting somebody. Anyway, they really went above and beyond to try to figure out the most effective way in terms of the online platforms. Leanne and Amy as well. The most effective way to do this virtually, and I know it was a lot of work on their end, and I have to say this really worked out very nicely. Everything from the presentations, the oral presentations to the posters as well. So thank you very much. That's all from me.
Thanks, Mike and Hank. I agree fully with all you said. Peter, can I talk to you to the group to make any kind of updates, provide any kind of updates on what's on the agenda for tomorrow?
Yes, you bet. Echoing Mike's thanks to the whole support team, everything on the websites and bashing on WebEx over and over again to see all the ways that it might break and try to avoid those. So it worked out really well. So tomorrow there will be a poster session from 1 to 2 that was organized by some of our early career researchers. Hats off to them. So dive into that. All of the posters will remain up unless there's some reason that someone needs to have their poster removed. We're going to leave it in the AGU poster space. There is some noise on the line. I don't know if you can use whoever that is. Another thing I wanted to add about the posters is that the iPoster folks have agreed that they can port these posters back into an editing space for you. So if you want any of these to update them for the AGU meeting in December for the above session, it'll save you a lot of work. And I'd encourage everybody to continue to use the iPoster platform to look at any of the posters that you haven't had a chance to see in this busy week. After the poster session, at 2:30 there will be 2 breakouts. Wetlands project coordination. I think this is a new effort. And there will also be an ad hoc discussion of insect disturbance also at 2:30. And then the carbon synthesis group, which has been meeting very regularly, led by Watson, Chatterjee, and Koman, and Farazooms, and others, is going to continue to plow through their edited agenda at 4 o'clock. And if you haven't been participating in that and you'd like to, I'm sure you would be welcome. Thanks, everybody. I think we do have a happy hour again this afternoon. If you happen to have the time and inclination, you can join some of us at that.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks to everybody who organized and support this meeting. It's been an interesting experience. I think it turned out quite well. Of course, it's not quite the same as face-to-face and having poster sessions with beer and breakout sessions and all that, but it's been quite productive and hugely useful to catch up on what everybody has been up to, building on all the working group activities and reports and so on. So it's been a success, I would say. Thanks to you all, and I appreciate that there are still 120 people tuned in at this time of day 3, and I hope that many of you will join again tomorrow to participate in the poster sessions and what we can do in terms of various breakout sessions. So, thank you all, and hope to hear from you all tomorrow, or at least virtually, and hope to see you all again soon. Otherwise, we'll be in touch for various communications and working group sessions and so on. Appreciate it. Take care. Stay safe.
Scott?
Yes. Hi.
I just wanted to add, we're working on setting up a poster session for the fire insect. I think there are 9 posters, but setting up a poster session for that tomorrow, either in the 4 to 5 spot or the happy hour tomorrow.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, coordinate with Peter and the group about that, if you haven't already. Glad to hear it.
I've already been in contact. So.
Okay, take care everybody, and we'll talk to you again soon.